Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second live YouTube office hours here at MedEdits. And I'm just going to double check that we are appearing live on YouTube. I see. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we are live right now, and so I just want to say welcome. We're happy this is working, although as of right now we still can't quite figure out how to get the video to play where we have the placeholder. So we will get all the technical stuff kind of up and running. So hello, some people are already saying hello. So I first just wanted to go over some recent developments that have happened this week, both in terms of medical school admissions as well as the residency batch. There have been several sort of exciting things that have happened this week. So let's first review those. And, we will be recording all of these office hours, so they will be posted later. So, people, of course, can watch them afterwards. So as probably most of you are aware, if you are applying to medical school, that the MCAT registration opened up this week for students who needed to take an MCAT either this summer or this fall. And we've obviously done several videos on those MCAT updates. Now, what is interesting, as if you were part of this registration, you know that the system crashed and was unable to handle the load of people that were waiting to register. So the AMC actually released some data that the max that they've ever had on average was between 10 and 12,000 people to come to opening day for registration. Well, this registration day, they had 62,000 people who were there to register for the MCAT when the system opened. And thankfully, everyone got appointments at the time and place that they expected to get those appointments. The other interesting thing that that the AMC has reported is that in the first 3 days of the application system opening, AMCAS opening, they had a 50% increase in the number of people who initiated AMCAS applications. And it is not clear if all of those people are going to submit their applications on May 28th, or if people just have more time on their hands. And so they opened their applications earlier, but aren't really ready to submit. But there was a 50% increase. I think the numbers were something like, instead of the normal 19,000 that they have opening applications in the first several days, they have, I think, 29,000. So that's also interesting. Now, on the residency front, there were some big announcements made recently, and they are requesting that programs do not start receiving residency ARIS applications until October 21st. Now, in the past, completed ARIS applications have been transmitted to programs on September 15th. So this year they're asking that those completed residency applications not be sent to programs until October 21st, and that date coincide with the same date that the MSPE or the Dean's letter is sent to programs. So they're doing this in an effort to kind of give students more time and to kind of alleviate some stress with regards to applying for residency. They have also requested that all residency programs have virtual interviews this year instead of having live interviews. And that is for both distant students and for local students, to make everything fair for everybody. So we will see how this progresses. We will do at some point a video on both the medical school admissions processes as they evolve, a more formal video, and one on the residency admissions process and how that is evolving, because obviously all of these changes are taking place very fast. It's tough to keep track of everything. So I'm just going to answer a couple of the questions that you've posted thus far on the chat. And I encourage everyone to post questions, as you have them, whether this relates to medical school, to residency, to pre-med. If these office hours become more popular, we may start dividing them up and actually having specific sections just for medical school applicants, pre-meds, residency applicants. So, let us know if these are helpful, and, and you can email us at info@mededits.com, and just let us know if these are useful for you, and what topics you would like us to see covering. So let me first ask, Mahola asks, so this cycle will be more competitive. We're not really sure. The AMC is saying it looks optimistic that we'll be, having a lot of people apply to medical school. It's not clear, right? If people were sort of logging into that system and initiating applications, maybe when they don't even really plan on applying this year, but they're doing it sort of more out of curiosity. It's also possible that people have more time to log into the system. So maybe it's not as if they're ahead. It's not as if they're, definitely applying, but they're sort of exploring. It's possible that people are sitting at home, and so they're not procrastinating as much. And so they're opening up the application earlier than they intended. Or maybe it is possible that, we are going to be seeing more applicants applying to medical school this year. So we aren't really sure what exactly that increase in the number of applications that have been initiated, what that really signifies. We're going to kind of have to wait to see. Based on our conversations with students, we sense that some students are sort of rather intimidated by COVID, and how that will impact the medical school admission season, and are therefore deciding not to apply because they're sort of timid about what this might entail for them. We expect that just as residency programs are being asked to conduct, now this just happened, now that residency programs are being asked to conduct virtual interviews, we expect that the medical schools are likely to follow that. The other big question is going to be, will there be MMI interviews? Because MMI interviews require, more people. It's a little more complex, and those are sort of a little tougher to orchestrate, especially online. Not that it can't be done. It would actually be fairly interesting to see how people did that in breakout rooms and stuff. But, I wonder if there will be no MMI interviews this year, but we have to wait and see on that too. So let me just sort of go over a few of these questions, and then I'm also going to answer some questions that have been sent to us ahead of time. We ask that you send us questions ahead of time to info@mededits.com, and just put in the subject line office hour question, and then we will try to get to as many of those questions that are emailed to us during our office hours. So someone is asking, I wanted to know, how would I go about adding any extenuating circumstances in my personal statements? Well, it really depends on what those extenuating circumstances are. If you are, disadvantaged, if you have self-declared yourself as disadvantaged, as you have 1,325 characters to write about your disadvantaged status in the MCAS application. So you have that opportunity. We find that most students who do consider them disadvantaged. We find that most of them write about that in the disadvantaged section of the MCAS application, and it comes up in some way, usually in the personal statement as well. Certainly the personal statement is the place to kind of address personal things that you wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to address elsewhere in your application. As most of you probably know, and we've gone over this in some of our videos, the main prompt is, why do you want to be a doctor? And in fact, we looked at the MCAS application this week, and while there is a more detailed prompt for the personal statement, that really is what the question that you have to answer in your personal statement is, why do you want to be a doctor? But the personal statement certainly is the place where we have our students kind of go into those personal details about their backgrounds and their candidacies that might be relevant to medical school admissions, or might be relevant to kind of painting a really full picture of who they are and what's important to them. Okay, hold on one second. Okay. On the MSAR, if I'm within the 10% quartile in terms of cumulative GPA, but not within the 10% quartile for science GPA and vice versa, should I still apply to that particular school? You know, a lot depends on state residency. You know, if this is a state school and you are out of state and they don't take a lot of out of state students, maybe not. If it also depends on where your MCAT is, right? So this is about balance. You know, we have some students who apply, let's say with a lower GPA, you know, below a 3.5, they have an upward trend and they have a really high MCAT, you know, that's above a 520. Maybe they had a very difficult major, took super duper rigorous course load at a school that was reputed to be very difficult, you know, and rigorous. So, you know, a lot of this is really about, well, what else is there in your metrics and what else is there about your candidacy that's going to balance everything else? That's a really tough yes or no type of answer to give. Okay, I'm going to get to the questions that we've been sent to us before as well, but just hold on. How long a typical shadowing experience should last? I'm planning on shadowing a private clinic. I wonder where you are, Melina, because a lot of shadowing is not happening right now, so good for you. We try to discourage our students from focusing on absolute numbers of hours that are needed. You want to participate in an experience that includes shadowing where you maximize your learning. So, you know, in different shadowing experiences, sometimes you might be with a physician who is really eager to have you there, who really wants to teach you, who has a very diverse and vibrant practice, and maybe you can shadow there, you know, for 8 weeks over the summer, you know, 3 days a week, and still be learning and still be gaining something from that experience. Or maybe it's, you know, a surgeon who has office hours and OR time, and so you get a really kind of broad idea of what it means to practice medicine, and so you don't get bored. You know, we generally tell people once the learning stops, maybe that's time to find another experience. When it comes to shadowing, we also really encourage students to gain as much exposure to different specialties in medicine and in different settings in medicine. So the way that medicine is practiced, for example, in a private office is very, very different than how that same specialty might be practiced in a hospital or an academic setting. So, you know, the practice of medicine really varies tremendously depending on, you know, on where you're practicing. And that's something that, you know, in terms of making career decisions is very important to understand. You know, medical students typically get most of their exposure in academic hospitals, when the majority of them are going to end up practicing in private settings, and sometimes that can lead to, you know, to sort of a lack of understanding of what they're actually going to be doing, you know, when they actually are practicing. So diversity is key, both with regards to specialty and with regards to practice setting. Just keep that in mind. All right, this is actually a good question from Alicia. My school's pre-med committee allows a max of 5 letters of recommendation to be sent for committee letter. I know that the MedEdits article says ideal is 6. Thank you for referencing our article. I appreciate that. So who should I be asking for the 5? Okay, so we do have a great article that we will link in the comments about letters of recommendation for medical school. The most important letters that you will get as your letter complement are going to be science letters, so letters from science professors. Below that becomes principal investigators or people with whom you've worked with in research. Those are also very important letters, as well as math letters. I'd consider those, you know, a very strong math letter and a very strong PI letter to be equal. Now, if you have, let's say, majored in a non-science, you want to try to get a letter from someone within your major, you know, because obviously you've spent a lot of time focusing on that discipline. Things like shadowing letters, volunteering letters, those are great to have as, you know, as part of your letter complement, but in reality, those letters typically serve as more character references than anything else. Now, something that you can think about if your school only allows 5 letters to be in the committee letter and you have 6 really strong letters of endorsement, you can think about having that 6th letter writer send in their own letter. So, so you send the 5 through the committee, and then you can actually download, a letter request form, and you can have that 6-letter writer upload the letter themselves, which is what some people are doing when they don't have a committee letter. So there are ways to get around this if your school only allows you to have a certain number of letters. So kind of keep that in mind. What is a suboptimal number of hours for shadowing / clinical exposure to admissions committee? That's a really good question. So what is sort of the bare minimum? I would say, we will typically have students who have shadowed, let's say, a few different specialists, maybe 10 hours each, and they have, 30 to 50 hours max. I would say that becomes the bare minimum. Most people have some type of other clinical exposure, whether they worked as EMTs on campus or, at some other point, even in high school. For some students, they might have worked as EMTs depending on where they live. Some students are now, taking gap years and scribing or working as medical assistants. They're volunteering in free clinics. Some students are still going abroad. Obviously, that's not happening now. And many medical schools honestly don't necessarily look incredibly favorably upon those, paid offshore clinical experiences. But obviously those experiences aren't happening this summer anyway. Certainly, global medical brigades is quite popular among college students. So, most of our students will have some sort of mix of clinical exposure. But certainly, I'd say shadowing, the bare minimum is going to be a total of like 30 to 50 hours. Should I keep taking my prerequisites online? That's another great question. So medical schools are taking courses, prerequisites, they're accepting those prerequisites online because the colleges are obviously closing and online is the only option. Now, if you are taking online courses and your college or university is allowing you to take those courses for a grade, you should opt for the grade. Okay, I can tell you the AACOMAS application just opened up this past week. All the days blur together now that we're all sort of under quarantine, but that was this week they opened, and they specifically asked on their application, is your school allowing you to take courses for grade? So they want to know this because if you had the option to take it for a grade, they want to see the grade. So that is obviously preferred, but of course, online courses right now are acceptable to all medical schools. Do medical schools in general typically look down on applicants that graduate in their 5th year versus applicants that graduate in their 4th year, however, still taking a 5th year? I wouldn't say there's a blanket response to that. If you are challenging yourself academically and you are pursuing your intellectual and scholarly interests and you are taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to you, and you have a good reason for graduating in 5 years because you wanted to do a second major or you had, extra courses that you really wanted to take, no one's ever going to criticize you for that. I think that does working as a medical technologist count as clinical experience? Absolutely. You're working with patients, you're understanding the clinical environment, you're learning about medicine, potentially, depending on where you're working as a medical technologist, you're also learning about different specialties in medicine. So that's actually a great way to learn about medicine. I can tell you, having worked, in the emergency department for many, many years, our support staff was vital to our operations and our ability to practice medicine and take care of patients. So working as a medical tech, a medical technologist, a phlebotomist, even a transporter. Honestly, these are great ways to sort of learn about what hospital operations are about and what the practice of medicine is about. And so, the practice of medicine is really, it really requires you to work as a member of a team. So, however you get a window into that world is valuable. There are a lot of good questions here today. Is there a guideline to follow on how to pick schools? We have another great article about how to create a school list. So certainly, we can put a link to that as well. So creating a good school list, this is key to success. One of the biggest mistakes that we see when students are not accepted to medical school is because they haven't curated a school list that will guarantee their success. So one of the things that we definitely work on with our students is we make sure that their school list is going to lead them to success, and that really is key. And we do have a good article that we will link to that will help you to kind of select those schools. People are asking about services. We don't really like to answer those on forums such as this, but we do comprehensive review for pre-medical students to let you know how competitive you are, what else you need to do to improve your candidacy, if anything, and where you should be applying. We like to give students solutions. So, if we don't feel you're competitive for medical school, depending on what type of medical school you want to go to, allopathic or osteopathic, we always try to, give you solutions and goals to keep in mind. Are volunteer or shadowing hours weighed heavier? It's not really, again, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. So, if you were a volunteer, let's say at a hospice, or let's say at a shelter or something like that, and you took on a leadership role, or you initiated something like getting shoes for homeless people, that was a smashing success. That's going to be valued. So don't think about in terms of which hours are valued more. Think about it in terms of impact. Obviously, shadowing often means impact. Shadowing. So I would say that shadowing, you should focus more on terms of what are you learning, and when does that learning sort of plateau. But in terms of a volunteering experience, think about what can you do to really make a valuable impact. That's how you should think about those experiences. Are applicants with fewer shadowing hours considered less favorable? Not necessarily. Again, this is about what else have you done? Have you done research? Have you done, valuable community service? Have you done valuable teaching? This is all about, kind of looking at your application as a whole. As I've said in other office hours, this is going to be one of the most holistic years in medical school admissions, just because of COVID and everything that's happening. And, medical school admissions committees really want to understand your whole story and how you've contributed, across the board. Okay, let's see here. I volunteered the ED where I got exposed to patient care, both in peds, trauma, and the ER. Is that enough to supplement my shadowing experience? Very possibly. It depends on, how long you volunteered in the emergency department. I love emergency departments, not because I'm an emergency physician, but because I think that these are great places to learn, because you get so much exposure to so many specialties and so many different types of patient presentations. And you really understand, the art of medicine and how to diagnose patients and how to take a good history and how to work under pressure, and how to collaborate. And there are always, different consultants from other specialties coming down. So you learn about those specialties in medicine. So, I think the emergency department is one of the best places in the hospital to learn. Really, you learn about critical care. You learn about primary care, because a lot of people come into the emergency department, maybe not now in our, with COVID, but typically, people come in, with other types of problems. So if you volunteered for 2 years in the emergency department, that's pretty good. You saw a lot and you learned a lot, and you learned about peds as well as adult medicine. That's terrific. How much considerations do schools put towards a do-it-yourself post-bac? I did 30 credits. I've medical. Yeah. So whether you choose to do it your DIY post-bac or a formal program, medical schools don't necessarily favor one versus the other. If you did well, if you challenged yourself, it's not as if a DIY post-bac is going to be looked upon less favorably than a formal post-bac. Formal post-bacs are great because, you have the camaraderie of having a peer group, and, and you have mentorship, and you have people who are advising you and writing you letters and writing you committee letters. But sometimes I think that a do-it-yourself post-bac is actually maybe more respected in some way, just because it takes a bit more initiative, and it shows a bit more independence, that you were able to do that, and maturity. So that is not a bad thing at all. I'm going to actually go to our questions that were sent to us in advance, just to make sure that we get to those, and then I'll go back to the YouTube questions. just be patient. Hold on. Okay. So someone actually asked, this was actually a good question. So someone who's been working in their family's optometry practice, right? So optometry, this is not an MD, this is an optometrist, answering phones, filing, and, but also taking vital signs, right? So for those of you who have been to an optometrist before, you know that they do a basic medical history and, check intraocular pressures. And so, all of that experience is great, even though you're not working with an MD or a DO, okay? Anytime where you're interacting with patients, you're understanding people's comorbidities, other medical problems, you're talking to people, you're understanding kind of what their challenges are, what their medical problems are, you're learning. And so it doesn't really matter if that's, necessarily an MD, a DO, or an optometrist. I wouldn't recommend that be your only clinical experience, right? So if you're applying to an MD school, they want to know that you've had experience to, doctoring under MD. But that would be a great supplemental experience. So this is a Canadian student who wants to apply to US medical schools with a cumulative GPA of 3.87 and an MCAT of 516. However, I scored a 124 on CARS. What is your opinion on retaking the MCAT? I wrote it 3 times. 3 times is the absolute max that we recommend taking the MCAT. So understanding kind of how MCAT scores are viewed, because, of course, some schools will super score or take your highest score, but schools will see every single MCAT you've taken ultimately. In the ideal world, you should take the MCAT once and you should get the absolute highest score you possibly can, okay? If you have to take it twice, that's okay. Many students have to take the MCAT twice. You want to try to bump your second MCAT score, of course, depending on where the first one was, by at least 3 points. 3 times is the absolute maximum, right? Because then it starts seeming as if you're kind of gambling a little bit, So typically when we see students who've taken the MCAT more than 3 times and they've slowly gone up and up and up, those students are not usually successful in the medical school application process. So with nearly a 3.9 of a cumulative GPA and a 516, those are great stats. The 124 on CARS could hurt you at some schools if they screen out for a low score on any one section. But what this is telling me is that you did very, very well on your other sections. If there's one section score that can be on the lower side and that will be forgiven by medical school admissions committees, it's the CARS score. So I'd say that's one place where you can actually get a lower score and potentially be okay. So someone else asked, I have an MCAT score of 514, undergraduate GPA of 3.45, and an SMP graduate GPA of 3.67. Is this good enough for mid-tier to top-tier schools? It depends on what the other experiences are. The 3.67 SMP postgraduate GPA is outstanding, and certainly assuming that you had an upward trend as an undergraduate, the 3 point, and it's, depending on where you went to undergraduate college, a 3.45 is not a deal breaker by any means. 514 is a completely solid score. So this will depend to some degree on what your other experiences are, what your letters of reference look like, where you are from, what state you're from. I would say that with these numbers, unless you have something that is really outstanding on the research front or in some other way, that a top tier school is probably not within reach, but certainly a mid-tier school could be, depending on other factors. Absolutely. Okay. Okay, so this is from a student who said that they applied last cycle, did not get in, got 2 interviews, and they're asking if they should ask their letter writers about the quality of the letter. Probably not. It's not a great idea to ask a letter writer about a quality of letter. If we have somebody, a student who has applied to medical school and did not get in, and we just can't find anything in the application that kind of stands out to us as the reason why they didn't get in, we always think, okay, were the letters of reference lukewarm or mediocre, which can, really kill someone's candidacy. What we recommend in these situations is that rather than asking the letter writer, because that sort of puts people on the defensive a bit, if you have, if you're at school and you have a pre-med advisor who has access to those letters, to ask them sort of politely, can you let me know, are there any letters that maybe I shouldn't be including in my application this year? And they obviously aren't allowed to tell you about the content of those letters because you've waived your right to read them. But sometimes they will sort of give you a bit of a hint. Well, maybe we should just include these 3 letters this year. And so that definitely happens. After the student was rejected, they had a conversation with one of the members of the medical school admissions committee, who said that the application was, and credentials were strong, but they didn't stand out. What would you be able to do to stand out? And that obviously is a very, very general question. And this is really where our expertise is. It is very difficult sometimes when you are writing your application yourself and you're looking at your life and you're looking at your experiences and you're looking at your academic interests and your academic accomplishments to understand, well, how do I put this together in a way that will be interesting and will help me to stand out? And we don't even like to sort of think about standing out relative to other applicants, because most pre-med students have, for the most part, done a lot of the same types of activities and have taken a lot of the same courses. So this is about writing about your observations and your insights and what you gained from those experiences. And also writing potentially about, what are your academic interests, your scholarly interests, your research interests, your background. So we really try to help you to sort of figure out what are those experiences on both a personal, academic, extracurricular, clinical, on all of those different fronts, whatever it is that you have, excelled in. I mean, let's say, for example, if we're working with a varsity athlete who's done 4 years of a varsity sport, obviously that experience, they need to write about that in their personal statement. It's important to them. They've spent a long time with that. It is, they've learned a lot of things that are applicable to medicine through that experience. So we really work with you to try to figure out what are the experiences that are the most distinguishing for you, and that kind of really outline how you've ended up at this place. And we also tried to really kind of pull out, what are the things that you gained from each of those experiences. And the key is also to have a very well-balanced application and a well-balanced personal statement, because, it is ultimately your written application, meaning your work and activities and your personal statement together with your coursework, your grades, your MCAT, and your letters of reference that are going to sort of motivate someone to actually want to meet you. And that's really how you have to think of your primary application. It's the thing that will inspire people to want to meet you. Okay. Okay. Will I be looked down upon if I'm a biology major and the majority of my courses were biology or science courses in general? Asking because I know medical schools like diversity. Yeah, medical schools like diversity, but they like bio majors. Do they also want philosophy majors who've done upper level sciences? Sure. I mean, they don't want an entire class full of biology majors, but the fact is that the majority of pre-medical students do major in one of the sciences. And you can actually look at one of our articles that kind of breaks down what are the best majors for pre-meds. And this is a really tough question to answer, because it isn't sort of so much what is the best major, but what's interesting is which majors performed the best in terms of the GPA they earn and the MCAT they earn. And that some of that data is actually fairly interesting. But you should not choose a major based on what you think is going to be the most appealing to medical school admissions committees, because there is no one major that is most appealing to medical school admissions committees. Yes, they want a diverse class of students, but still a large percentage of those students will major in the sciences, and certainly biology is one of the most popular majors among pre-medical students. Do medical schools weigh a post-bac GPA higher than a cumulative GPA? They look at everything, right? So they're going to look at the undergrad GPA, and then they're going to look at the post-bac GPA. If you took a true post-bac and you really didn't do any of your requirements as an undergraduate, what that is going to say to a medical school admissions committee member is that you really weren't interested in medicine as an undergraduate. And so, you know, for many students, they're not as serious as undergraduates. They don't have that focus, that maturity. They didn't necessarily kind of, you know, have a real career path in mind. And sometimes that leads them to a lack of focus and an underperformance. So if you were underperformed as an undergraduate and then you did a post-bac and you did phenomenally well, obviously those two things are almost going to be looked at separately. Okay, so this is a really good question. So what are your thoughts on an applicant who is applying with a pending retake on the MCAT? Pending means still have to take the MCAT, haven't been able to due to the pandemic. You are in very, very good company. And medical schools this year are definitely making allowances for students who have later MCATs that are on the way. You know, the latest MCAT that we are recommending, and we have a good video on this to kind of really map out the timeline for you. The latest MCAT that we are recommending is August 1st, because that's the last date where the scores will be expedited. And those scores being expedited, if you do everything right, submit your application on time, work on your secondary essays, you know, those MCAT scores should sort of hit the admissions offices at around the same time as your application would be complete, and you really won't lose much time because AMCAS is being submitted 2 weeks later to medical schools, right? So usually AMCAS is transmitted, the verified applications are transmitted to medical schools at the end of June, but now they're being transmitted to medical schools, you know, on July 12th. So that's sort of buying people some time. And medical school admissions committees, like I said, are also going to be looking at things much more holistically this year. If for some reason people are not able to take the MCAT this summer, again, depending on how things go with COVID, medical schools, of course, are going to be making changes. The California schools, as I've said in other videos, have really been the best that we've seen in terms of really coming out and stating what their new policies are with regards to delayed MCATs. Some schools are updating their deadlines and things in the MSAR. Not all schools are, though, however. So in other words, if you have all your ducks are in a row, you're ready to apply this year, assuming you're taking the MCAT by August 1st, you should definitely sort of continue with that plan and don't defer, don't sort of deviate from that plan. Even though, as I said at the beginning of this office hours, for those of you who didn't see it, many more people have actually initiated AMCAS applications this year than in past years. It doesn't mean this is going to be a more competitive year. I still think it could be a less competitive year because students are asking similar questions to considering, delaying their application to next year because they're afraid of everything that's going on, and it just is a little uncomfortable and unsettling, which is totally understandable. But I think ultimately this could end up being the less competitive year, and next year could be the more competitive year. Of course, nobody really knows. That's just a guess, hopefully an educated guess. Okay, so someone has a 3.95 in their DIY post-bac after getting a 3.2 undergraduate GPA, which would then boosted to a 3.44. I'm still scared. My chances with a 5.06 MCAT. Assuming that you are not retaking the MCAT, we would have to look at other parts of your candidacy. Are there other things that would sort of detract or allow that MCAT to be viewed in a different way? And what I mean by that is, are you an underrepresented minority? Are you first generation or from an underserved background? Because the fact is that those groups of applicants are looked at as a different cohort, and so you have to review what the stats are for people within your cohort. So for some cohorts, a 5.06 MCAT is not a deal breaker. You also have to look at is your state residency. So there are some state schools where again a 5.06 is not a deal breaker, but there are other state schools where a 506 is going to be too low. So we need to understand more about your background and your state residency to really be able to guide you. We certainly have had students with 506s who've gotten into allopathic medical schools, but there's always sort of a different type of circumstance that allows them to do that for the most part. And of course, for osteopathic medical schools, you certainly are competitive without question. What would be considered late for AA comas? That's a good question. AA comas typically tends to operate on a little bit of a later timeline. Again, this year, we have no idea. Everything is a little bit of a guess. I would say ideally you want to get your AA comas application in by the beginning of July, if that's possible. It's always a little bit later in terms of what we recommend for AA comas, because they do tend to kind of go a little bit later than MCAT schools. Okay, I've been taking MCAT practice exams. I'm scheduled to take it in 3 weeks. I've been scoring 508, 510. Should I postpone my MCAT? I want to be early in my application. My GPA is 3.5. Well, the GPA is where you want it to be. Again, we would want to look at your course rigor. We'd want to look at your grade trends, but 3.5 is kind of, what we recommend as sort of the bare minimum ballpark for to be competitive for allopathic medical schools. 510 as well is kind of, that's sort of the minimum that we recommend if you want to be competitive for allopathic medical schools. If your goal is osteopathic, 510 is great. Like I, mentioned for Blue, who asked a similar question, a lot is going to depend on your background, your other circumstances, what cohort of applicants do you fit into, and where are you from? What state are you from? So these are all things that we look at when we try to advise our students. Okay, I love this question. What is the best way to prepare for the Casper test? And I will be doing a video on this shortly. Casper is nothing to stress about. We tell students this every year. We understand there are for-profit companies that try to, to freak you out and get you to spend money on prep, okay? For Casper, you need to take the practice. First of all, you need to watch the practice scenarios, and you need to take the practice test that they offer, okay? We know people who've graded Casper, okay? We know people in admissions offices in terms of how they evaluate Casper. When you are answering Casper questions, you literally will have time to write 2 to 3 sentences per question, okay? Assuming you don't say anything racist, sexist, or completely offensive, you're going to do fine on Casper. All right, Casper is not used as a way to determine whether or not you get an interview. It is used, sort of as almost a way to kind of make sure that everything else matches up. The AAMC is actually creating their own situational judgment test, which they are using this year with 2 medical schools, I think UC Davis and Minnesota. I have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure it's going to impact about 11,000 applicants. I anticipate once that test rolls out fully that, because Casper as well as a situational judgment test, I think that Casper will be a thing of the past for US medical schools. That's like a year or 2 away, I would imagine. Don't stress about Casper, okay, please. Our students do very well. The key is to type quickly, okay, and try not to leave questions unanswered. That means you can't spend any extra time on any individual question, okay? Sometimes we look at these these sample questions, what people are writing, and they're 3 paragraphs long, and that's literally impossible. Okay, having talked to Casper graders or raters, there really is very little that differentiates Casper question answers that students give. So like each Casper grader, for example, is assigned 1 scenario, and they basically rate all of those answers that a slew of students will give, and they say there really is very little differentiation between how they rate one to the next, and as long as you don't have any red flags, again, you're going to be fine on Casper. So take the practice test, don't stress. Okay. I was considering using a hobby as the topic of my How I Faced Adversity essay. Do you feel that such a topic would lead to a weak essay? It depends on the hobby. It depends on how significant that hobby was to you and how it sort of illustrates the adversity, right? When you're asked about adversity, they want to understand, what are your coping skills? Can you cope? What do you do? How resilient are you? So as long as it kind of addresses all of those things, I guess that could work. I mean, most people don't write about a hobby when they're writing about an adversity, but it depends on how you, kind of how you phrase this and how you sort of frame it with everything else. Okay, when is the best time to get TMD SAS submitted? TMD SAS also seems to, have a different timeline for TMD SAS because historically those interviews happen a little sooner. I would say try to get TMD SAS submitted as soon as you can. But I actually need to review and see what TMD SAS has said with regards to COVID. Last I checked, last we looked at sort of everything that has been published, there really hasn't been much that's been said about those deadlines and, and what's happened with TMD SAS. But I would say that's a system that you probably want to submit sooner rather than later. And I would say as long as you submit by July 1, you're in good shape. Okay, but obviously earlier is always better as a general rule. Okay. What do you think is the likelihood of the MCAT dates still getting canceled due to COVID? I have no idea. This is everybody wants to know the answer to that question. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. Anything. I mean, this pandemic is really something, and things look like they're opening up. Nobody knows that. We should ask Dr. Fauci that question. I don't know. Is it a bad idea if a person does not want to go to medical school in their states? Depends on how competitive you are, right? So for most medical school applicants, their state schools become their safest schools for most, not all. And if you don't want to go to your state school, that's okay, as long as you're competitive enough to get into other schools as an out-of-state resident. I mean, there are some schools that are really great to be from because they have medical schools that almost exclusively accept in-state residents, and they have relatively low stats. So there are definitely some states that are really good to be from. But if you're competitive, you certainly don't have to be committed to your state schools. Okay. When asking for letters of recommendation, should I specifically ask, hold on. Should I specifically ask for a strong recommendation? My pre-med advisor suggested that to have letters of rec that talk about my grades, that to not have letters that talk about my grades or MCAT. Well, your grades or MCAT will speak for themselves. So, but typically if you're going to ask a professor for a letter, that professor will discuss what grade you received in his or her class. So I wouldn't say that's, necessarily true, but you when you ask for a letter of reference, I mean, sometimes you have a relationship with a professor or a principal investigator, and you kind of have an idea if they're going to write you a letter. There's never anything wrong with saying to somebody, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of reference? It's very, very rare that someone's going to say, you know what, I'm really not comfortable. I'm not sure I could write you the strongest letter, but it does happen. So it's always good to phrase it that way. Obviously right now, there are very few in-person, requests for letters of recommendation. So it's probably best to email and to follow up with a phone call if necessary. I'm getting ready to start my senior year of undergrad and considering transferring to a more competitive university. Would this raise red flags? Not necessarily, as long, we definitely have students who transfer. You need to explain, why did you transfer? If there's a good reason for the transfer, then it doesn't raise red flags at all. I mean, most people don't transfer as seniors, but certainly, let's say there was something, an academic you had an academic interest, and this university had a professor that focused on that or was doing research on that, and as long as the reason for the transfer is a good reason, that's okay. Okay.
Did you see this one? My PI is an MD.
Oh, if my PI is an MD, would that qualify as a letter of rec from a physician? Well, it would be a research letter. Again, letters of recommendation from physicians that you've shadowed are not really the most important letters in your profile. So a PI letter is a more important letter. That would be a great letter to get, because assuming that your PI is also practicing medicine, they could intelligently write about your contributions in your research and your intellectual abilities, along with all of those other qualities and characteristics that medical school admissions committees are seeking. But they could also discuss that they feel that you have, as a physician, they know that you have the qualities and characteristics necessary to be a doctor, right? Because only a doctor can really speak to that in a real way. Oh, this is a good question. At least how many of the 15 core competencies should we try to incorporate into the personal statement? If you write fully about your experiences, and you don't, you only want to think of this in terms of your personal statement, but you want to think of it in terms of your application entries. So the 15 core competencies, I don't like students to sort of go through a checklist and say, okay, that one's covered in my statement, that one's covered, that, because that then leads to a fairly contrived personal statement that is not going to necessarily flow well. Between your personal statement, your application entries, and your letters of reference, it's likely that almost all of those 15 core competencies are going to be mentioned in some capacity. So I don't even like to think about this in terms of how many. I would say you want to try to get some of those core competencies in maybe in each category. Obviously the academic ones are a bit tough to really incorporate into a personal statement, but you want to get certainly enough of them in each category. You want to try to cover those in your personal statement and or your application entries. I was supposed to start a medical job this summer during my gap year, but the start has been halted due to the virus. How should I address this in my application? This is a really good question. And actually, the AA-COMAS, the osteopathic application, specifically has an essay question this year about COVID. We anticipate that many medical schools are going to be having secondary essays about COVID. Please tell us, how your education was impacted, how your experiences, your academics, how personally what was impacted. I think that a lot of medical schools are going to have an essay of that nature. You could, depending on your personal statement, you could sort of mention it maybe in your personal statement, of course, depending on what else you've done. If the medical job was sort of something that was, really going to be one of your first medical related experiences, you could kind of mention your personal statement. This summer I was planning on working as blah, 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 but sadly that got canceled. And I am hoping that, maybe next year or once, things have improved with the pandemic, that I'll be able to gain some clinical exposure. A lot of my friends are using Interfolio for their letters of recommendation. Is there any benefit to using this service? Not necessarily. I mean, it's people will use Interfolio or letter dossier service because they might ask for letters over time, and that's just a great way to sort of have a centralized place where people can send their letters of reference, and it just makes it easy then to submit those. There's no real benefit necessarily. It just helps students to be organized. I'm just reading these questions. What is the latest time to take the MCAT for this cycle? What is the best time? As I've said before, and we have a video on this, we feel the latest you should take the MCAT if you are applying the cycles August 1st, because that will not delay things in terms of the overall review of your application when your application can be complete. So assuming that MCATs actually continue to happen in June, July, and August. If you take the MCAT, August 1st at the latest, that's not going to sort of delay your application being complete, and you won't be a late applicant that way. Okay, hold on. Okay. If you graduate in 2021, decide that you want to apply, is that like, sorry, I'm not understanding this. Okay, so let me kind of go over the time frame. So if you graduate in 2021 and you decide you want to apply in 2021, then you'll have one gap year. I think that answers your question. So in other words, the year that you're applying to medical school, it's a full year. So students who are applying now are not matriculating into medical school until August of 2021. Someone wrote a response, I was going to apply, but I heard you can't get in without clinical experience. It's very tough to get in without clinical experience. This is true. But keep in mind that what you do over your application year is very beneficial. And you can update schools about your experiences and things like that. And yeah, if you have no clinical exposure at all, that could be a reason, depending on other aspects of your application and your background and your candidacy, that could be a reason to maybe to wait until next year. Okay. All right, so I think we are going to wrap things up. And I hope this was helpful to all of you. Most of these questions were about medical school. If there's anybody out there who has questions about residency, we're happy to do another office hours where we go over how the residency process is changing and what you can do to kind of get your rotations in, and how this is going to impact the upcoming residency match, because the same way that COVID is impacting medical school admissions, it's also really impacting the residency match as well. The residency match has officially asked that all programs go to virtual interviews. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same happens with medical school interviews. So we're gonna have to kind of watch out for that. But we really want to keep you updated with everything that's going on. So please, subscribe to our channel if you don't already subscribe. Sign up for our newsletter, and email us if you have any other questions. We're also happy to work with you if you want help on your application, your personal statement, your work and activities, whatever else you need help with. We obviously work with students on all aspects of the process and throughout the continuum of medical education. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight, and we wish you all the best of luck, and please stay healthy and stay sane. And we realize this is a very stressful time, more stressful than it has been maybe in past years, but we're all going to get through. And thankfully the AMC and everyone in medical education is trying to make as many allowances as they can to make this a less stressful process. So thank you so much, and good night, and we will see you soon. Take care.